Thank you for joining us on this Centre for Systems Engineering and Innovation webinar. We're currently celebrating 10 years of fostering systems engineering leadership and research at Imperial. And this is part of our 2020 webinar series with a theme around future infrastructure design and planning for resilient societies, and particularly around climate resilient societies. And today's Earth Day, and we're delighted to have Corina Kwami with us presenting on sustainable living places, infrastructure systems, stakeholders and shared perspectives. It's our kind of first experience of doing this as a webinar, and what I would encourage you to do as audience is make sure your mic switched off, but also then to use the chat to put questions into to Corina as she's talking, and I'm sure Corina will pick them up and address them as she goes, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions at the end. And we will put, yes, so I think I'm going to just introduce James McGilvray and Anna Miek, who will join in the panel at the end, and then I'm going to hand over Corina. So we're really interested to see what you're going to talk to us about, and I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Again, I will follow on from Jennifer's intro that we find ourselves in very unprecedented times, a bit unbelievable at times, and I guess also a moment of, it's a bit uncanny, I would say. I think a month ago when we were discussing taking this forward and what it would look like, obviously the format of these events being very much a lunchtime seminar in person, but I do think this challenge presents some really cool opportunities. So thoughts, ideas on how delivering this type of content in this form is always welcome. But with that, I'll give a little bit of an overview and introduction from my side. I'm just going to share my screen. Cool. So you can all see that. Great. So again, the title being around sustainable infrastructure, stakeholders, and shared perspectives. This very much emerges from our work at the Royal Academy of Engineering on sustainable living places. Now, before we get started, I want you to just test out that your chat function works. And I'd love if you could write in the chat function just one word that describes either the sector or the discipline that you identify with closely, or that the work you're currently engaged in touches on. And I do this namely because in the spirit of this new challenge and new sort of approach to delivering these kinds of seminars, we're finding that we're getting interest and feedback from such an amazing range of sources, and we just want to capture a bit of that. So with that being said, again, I'm based at the Royal Academy of Engineering in the National Engineering Policy Centre. My background is mainly, I would say, infrastructure, sustainability, and climate change, though I started off my career in public health about 10 years ago. And 4 or 5 years in, I made the shift into infrastructure. Not saying these two things are separate, but at the time I remember thinking I really wanted to work on the environments and the places in which we are finding health promotion and well-being to be critical. So I feel I've come full circle in this COVID climate back to those questions. But today I'll very much be presenting on an ongoing work in progress at the Royal Academy of Engineering. And of course, this center being hosted by the Centre for Systems Engineering was a welcome opportunity, namely because we'll be covering a bit around systems thinking and some creative ways of applying it. So again, before I get started, the work we've done has been overseen by an amazing collection of folks in our steering group at the Royal Academy of Engineering. So I'd like to thank them. Of course, our team within the Policy Centre. I've listed a few names here, Philippa Westbury and Andrew Chilvers, though the input from across the Royal Academy has been wonderful in terms of the communications, international team. So there are very many partners that we haven't covered within our own organization, but again, this is definitely a group effort. The number of stakeholders who've been involved in various ways, either taking part in the project itself or providing advice and engagement. So I'll be coming more to talk about this, but I wanted to share that. Is there a bit of, can you hear me okay? Okay, cool. So just a few guiding notes for the session. This is meant to be a multi-way exchange to share ideas on this work in progress. This is no silver bullet. So for thinking that we will have a golden solution at the end, this is probably not the best call. However, the things that we've developed, and for today will be very much around the systems maps, they've been developed with a group of stakeholders on a particular day. And they're definitely not the gospel truth, but they do help to facilitate an understanding of the system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through sort of the early project objectives. I'll share a bit about the context for how this developed into sustainable living places. I'm going to share the findings and then speak through a bit of the approach of how we got there. As I said, the work done here by the National Engineering Policy Center was very much at the crux of working across the profession of engineering. We do quite a bit of work on different policy streams, though the work here was very much in support of our government stakeholder and government client, the Infrastructure Projects Authority. So they had commissioned this project to apply systems thinking to the system for delivering sustainable living places. And we found that this opened up a lot of discussions around what is the system, what are the boundaries. The work from their side was very interested in capturing the process of working with diverse stakeholder groups within and beyond engineering, and to identify leverage points in the system for creating sustainable living places. Talk a bit more about the definitions and the themes and methods we've chosen, but on the right-hand side is a diagram that actually predates this project by a couple of years. Our team has several folks who've worked in systems thinking in different perspectives. And a lot of it for engineers, particularly, is grounded in infrastructure and thinking about the wider system in which or system of systems in which that is nestled. So as you can see in this theme, they are nested. So we have individual projects in the center, obviously individual sectors around it, the national infrastructure system of systems, and then, of course, these social, environmental drivers that do color how we look at these different systems. So for me, coming into this from a public health perspective, I was also very interested in the sort of social, environmental, and economic settings in which our infrastructure is situated. And of course, there are constraints and enablers that push us in one direction or pull us in another. But again, the context for this specific piece of work, again, predated the project start about 18 months, where the Infrastructure Projects Authority and some of our fellows had been talking a lot about this plan to deliver large-scale housing at scale in the UK and what this means. And of course, this is not a theoretical idea. This is something in practice and in planning already. Namely, the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, which I'll talk a little bit about today, is a scheme to deliver nearly 1 million homes by 2050. This includes large-scale commitments to deliver infrastructure in the form of rail and roads. And it also, at the time, we're in different times now, but called for a new deal on infrastructure and housing. Now, we did see, of course, with the last the budget announcements and the infrastructure strategy that was due to come. Of course, with COVID, these are things that are probably going to be or are being updated. There was an interest in having a new way of working, a new way of thinking on how we deliver this. On the right-hand side is an image of what the arc in terms of productivity would look like. So by productivity, I mean new sectors for research and development, new places of work, and of course, where do we house folks moving into this area? So again, this is one just example of where thinking about the wider systems in which not just infrastructure, not just housing is situated. And this raises a bunch of questions of what does this mean going forward. Now, if we just take on the left-hand side a bit of a historical look, that the scale of house building in the UK has reached that scale about twice in our history. So we see before 1940 a peak of about 350,000 homes per year, and then a peak nearly rising from the end of the Second World War up to 1970s. So again, the scale of housing, I mean, 1 million houses in the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, and the scale of delivery for the country is beyond what we have currently done in the last 50 years. But what does this mean for places? What does this mean for not just speaking about homes, not just speaking about the infrastructure needed? And if we were to imagine, this is about, on the scale of homes, building on the scale of 1 million Milton Keynes per year in terms of housing. But again, raises questions about the need for new infrastructure that is needed ahead of new developments. And then on a sustainability front, considering how we are equipped to deliver on net zero and for existing places. So that's a bit of a typo. And then supporting retrofit of existing places. So these are huge challenges and questions that touch on so many different sectors, that if we are to think about sustainable living places, we do need to broaden our understanding of what that entails, but also thinking critically about who are the people that are going to be living here, and actually, if it's going to be a healthy, inclusive place, what are the sort of things we should be considering? So then the early days of sustainable living places, even the title itself, was very much informed by stakeholder engagement with our professional engineering partners, professional engineering institutions, but also folks across disciplines that brought a lot of new thinking for engineering and for the sectors that we engage with. We had set the definitions broadly around sustainability being referring to a low carbon agenda, moving towards net zero across all infrastructure, goods, services, and the built environment. Our definition in the final report is expanded quite a bit to account for the sustainable development goals, and to really tackle questions around inclusivity and affordability. The living aspect refers to different aspects of life, covering domestic, professional, and leisure, and should also reflect the needs of the different stages of life. So this would mean taking into account trends in aging populations, the political economy, productivity, and technology. And my favorite bit is very much around the places aspect, and expands our focus, again, reiterating, away from just building homes to cultivating the places and understanding that this is an evolving process. It's nonlinear. There are aspects of identity that should be considered. And if you think about places that you either love to visit or love to call home, there is much more than the bricks and mortar, and the things that draw you to build your communities, to want to share and develop in that space. So these are things that very much, if we go back to that early business around infrastructure sectors, these are sustainable infrastructure enables pathways in these directions. But what are some of the other things that we can learn from different sectors and disciplines? So one of many different themes that are going to come up around systems thinking, and I will caveat here: we've in this approach taken one of several different approaches to systems thinking. And for this talk, I realized that there are quite a lot of disciplines and sectors represented. So I'm going to very much do a general intro. I'm also going to put a bit of a personal spin on how I like to think about it. But again, caveat that the report does go into quite a lot of detail around the method and the steps that were taken. But I do like to take the acumen plus systems approach just as a starting point, namely because it works closely across different groups and organizations tackling issues in the world of social impact work. So for just to start, systems thinking takes into account the interactions between different parts of a system and aims to understand how together they are affecting change rather than trying to understand the different components in isolation. And I think this is an important concept just to start with. In a sense, we want to look at how, for example,
Corina, we've just lost your audio, and maybe I can.
Can you hear me now? It said I was muted. Sorry.
Yeah, I think someone was trying to I think someone was trying to make sure that all other participants were muted and that we could
Okay.
hear you properly. And
No
so it sounds like everybody else is muted now, and you're back. You're back with us.
No worries. Again, with these sort of interactions, it's I guess for everyone in this time, just understanding where our role is in the system. I was very much talking about the systems thinking approach. And I use systems thinking here as opposed to systems methodology or systems approaches, just as in a general introduction. Though in our report, we go into the detail of the approach we took and the specific methodologies that we draw on. I think at that point I had switched over to discussing leverage points. And namely, these are places within our complex system, be it a corporation, an economy, a city, where a shift can produce changes in other parts of the system. So I wanted to start with these two concepts, namely because for different approaches, they do have some commonalities. There are very real differences as to why you choose some approaches over others. But these are the sort of themes that I do see coming up quite a bit and in our work and scoping. But again, I think knowing and, well, not being able to see everybody, but knowing that folks are coming from very different disciplines to participate, I did want to take a very creative look at how we might conceptualize systems. Let me see if this is, mine is frozen, 1 second. Okay. So I would say this is a bit off-piste and not in our Acumen Plus or even Donella Meadows' book, but I guess some of you might have seen, I had some lovely tags on Twitter, particularly around what jazz can teach us around collaboration and working. And I do see there's some interesting parallels with systems thinking that can at least help us and provide a more of a neutral ground for thinking about systems, especially coming from different disciplines. So I want you to imagine, a song or a tune that you know really well. There is a melody, so there is the song you sing. There is a rhythm, so moving throughout that song, there are specific places where you stop or you pause or you speed up. And how these bits fit together, if you're playing a tune in a band, is really supported by harmony. So if you're thinking of a choir where folks are not all singing the same note, but there is a synergy, I'd like to use that as a discussion in harmony. There's also an element of improvisation. So with having a knowledge of the tune, the rhythm, and the harmony, there are aspects in a band, particularly for jazz, where improvisation becomes the way that we navigate. So when I think of systems thinking, I like to think of our wider system as the song, the whole piece that you listen to. And if you were to sing your part, you'd be singing a melody and using a rhythm and a harmony. So there are aspects, I think, in trying to visualize or at least to experience a system that music can help to illustrate. I won't go too much on the music front for the rest of this talk, but I did want to plant that seed in terms of how we might conceptualize systems. So again, for this project, I noted in the very beginning acknowledgements that we had a wide range of stakeholders who contributed and gave input through scoping, interviews, workshops, and also the work throughout. But again, it's to illustrate that the jam session, as it were, was very much cross-sector, cross-disciplinary. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you an image of the map that we developed. I'm going to talk through a few of the leverage points, so the places within the system we found where change could be affected if considered. And then I'm going to walk through the approach we took from start to finish. So if during this period, if there are questions or thoughts that come up, just pop them in the chat and we'll come back to them. So our systems map was for sustainable living places, has 5 thematic regions denoted by the colors. So in the top left, we have the centralization of planning and funding. Bottom left, we have an area that very much talks around leadership around climate change and the recognition of the need for a shared sustainability agenda. In the blue, we have a lot of discussions around planning and the role of residents, developers, and landowners who navigate the system in various ways. In the red, very much focuses on the developer role in the system, as we found developers had a critical role in so many different processes. So in a way, we're highly connected to several different parts of the map. And in the gray are very much areas and factors for how residents engage in delivering place. So when I talked about leverage points in terms of areas where change could be affected, the areas where there are loops in particular, so some of the somebody started sharing? Sorry, we're having a bit of a jazz moment. Here, is that back? I think that's back. What was I saying? Right. Okay. So with the loops for leverage points, I would just draw attention to the areas where there are loops. So for example, in the top right, you have resistance and residents engagement in public debate. So some of these this is a reinforcing loop. So it goes clockwise. It's not reinforced. It's not clockwise because it's reinforcing, but it is a reinforcing loop in the sense that there are some areas that were raised, particularly around resistance from residents, which media attention can reinforce their awareness of the places they live and some places where they're living and places where there are changes is happening. That's one example of a leverage point. The bottom left has a lot of discussions around the recognition of the need for a shared sustainability agenda. And this very much comes from the fact that there are it's recognition of the need for the agenda, but also that's influenced quite a lot by awareness of the actions and capacity required, or at least understanding that we don't have all the information that is required. And that has reinforced the need for leadership on climate change through existing committees that existed prior, such as the Committee for Climate Change, cross-departmental commitments to including the legal and political commitment to net zero, which came out last June. So some of these areas have come out as particularly strong in terms of areas we should consider, or we might want to consider in delivering these sustainable living places. Other types of leverage points are particularly areas that connect different regions of the map. So in other words, connect the brown area of the map to the blue. So for example, in the brown region around the centralization of planning and funding, there was a lot of discussion around silos between national and local government, and in many ways joining up of local plans with a national vision being a challenge because of that. And in some ways, if mechanisms that were enabling planning across different areas, or ones such as the duty to cooperate, which is in practice at the moment, were strengthened, there'd be opportunities for example, different local authorities to share the experience and knowledge of developing these frameworks across different places, which would feed into this blue area where master planning, developers, residents are all engaging in sort of delivering the planning and delivering the planning and delivery. So it's just a snapshot of the types of connections that we found, the leverage points, and where and how we described them. So what I'm going to do is I'll walk through some of the high level areas, or at least findings from these leverage points. So again, I nodded at the first one around leadership on climate change. And this very much just showed us the opportunity to encourage the development of a sustainability agenda around the target for net zero, to catalyze a cross-government plan. So again, pre-COVID, but very much, I think, still a priority for us nationally and globally, is to reach net zero. And because there is a prioritization that has already occurred for several different departments, and then see at local authority level, there is a real opportunity to use this sort of common, or at least shared priority to catalyze some really cool cross-government work for thinking about not just housing and infrastructure, but the wider placemaking aspects. The second one, again, I highlighted this in the map itself, but there is a real chance to an opportunity to facilitate support for local planning and better master planning that promotes mechanisms that enable planning across boundaries, and efforts to address regional disparities in productivity and access to social infrastructure. When I first showed you the image of the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, obviously that is a very specific project and a very specific part of the country where there has been a lot of investment in research and development. Again, sustainable living places, to think about this for the UK and the wider national government, a national area, there is a real need to think through some of these regional differences. And we've had some very fruitful conversations with folks from Scotland and different parts of the north, in particular of how some of these things would vary considerably given the regional differences. But again, this is an opportunity to think through and understand what those are and how we might influence them. The third one was around providing a flexible funding model for local authorities and an engagement model for residents to enable holistic business cases for place. Again, this is very much coming out of discussions where this very, what would you say, focused attempt on using cost-benefit analysis to identify our priorities does help us achieve some things, but when we're thinking about medium, long-term, and sort of the physical, cultural, social aspects of place, they can be left behind. So what this aspect of the map was very much getting at is how these flexible options might be tailored for local level, or could be administered nationally. So on the fourth one, this is very much around providing technical and financial support to planners. Unmute myself. This one comes up quite a lot in discussions around capacity for local authorities, but it does enable or inhibit in some ways how well planners can engage with residents, but also participating and being very active in the debate that residents do have. Particularly for addressing barriers to master planning and delivery. This was an area that came out as being a priority area. Okay, so, hold on. It just froze. Okay, so the last one, can't have a discussion without touching on the importance of data and data sharing, but particularly for the developer's role in the system and understanding their role more fully, as well as equipping residents to be able to engage and influence within these areas. Data sharing and platforms, particularly that enable data sharing, could very much help promote access to information about the planning process, how developers are navigating it, what types of projects are being approved, could actually help to build trust as well. Now, there is a hazard here because anytime we provide open access and open sharing, there could be bodies that have more power. And so the discussion around power and equity was very much caveating this finding, but nonetheless something that needs to be explored or should be explored. So what I will do now, having shared the map and shared some of our high-level leverage points and what they mean, I'm going to go through the approach we took to deriving the map, and then I'll show you the map again. So in some ways, you've heard the tune, and now I'm going to show you how we wrote it and all of the different bits that contributed to developing it, and then coming back to look at the map again. Then I do have a bit of a surprise in terms of an illustration that is being developed. So the approach we took very much had three phases that don't necessarily follow each other sequentially. They're very iterative, but for simplicity's sake, I'll describe them here. In the first instance, when I started back in last year, April, we underwent a process of scoping. So this included literature review and framing interviews with some of the stakeholders you saw in that illustration, but also really reaching out to expertise in housing, planning, infrastructure, but then also on the systems with small s front, knowing that there are quite a lot of different strands of systems engineering, of folks applying different systems approaches in different disciplines, and really trying to get a lay of the landscape. The second phase was very much having used the Acumen systems approach to map our system in a participatory way with stakeholders. So I'll show you some images here where we've mapped and listed out enablers and inhibitors in our SAT analysis, which informed the loops in the map. And then the last bit is very much looking at one specific strand of system dynamics. And again, this is a very specific approach for a very particular purpose, and very much draws on the work of Jay Forrester to inform our approach, but then the methods themselves have been very much informed by the help of Dr. Nikki Simmerman at UCL. So these bits are very, very targeted, and in the report go into a lot more detail. So for the mapping aspect, we held two very large systems mapping workshops. One was held in July and the other in September, where we brought together stakeholders across planning, housing, infrastructure, placemaking, behavioral scientists. We had folks from different branches from the creative sector, and really trying to put a very wide net in terms of how you would consider and describe sustainable living places. So in the workshops themselves, as you see here, we had folks around a table. We asked them individually to reflect on some of the enablers and inhibitors of sustainable living places in their particular work. So, for example, if we have a transport planner, they might be listing out specific enablers for inclusive mobility or things that inhibit it. And we asked them to do it individually before sharing to the wider group so that we could still capture the level of granularity and detail across those different sectors. So on the right-hand side is a list of some of them that came out around governance. The ones that are highlighted in blue are very specific ones where folks gave quite a lot of discussion in detail. But definitely for the report, there's about 7 different lists of these enablers and inhibitors in the appendix that give you a sense of how wide-ranging the discussions were. From there, the folks at the tables were asked to cluster and prioritize these enablers and inhibitors. So it's where there is a bit of bias and subjectivity based on who's at the table and who's sort of, I would say, influencing the group. But again, from the note takers and facilitators who helped to curate this workshop, we were able to capture some of those tensions. So the things that are prioritized here do have the caveat that they are nested alongside some very, very detailed discussions. So from those prioritized and chosen enablers and inhibitors, we asked folks to walk through what we call a SAT analysis. So some of you might be familiar with this already. For those of you who aren't, this is a guided process for thinking about the different institutions and processes that are central to the enabler or inhibitor. The SAT analysis also looks at the different attitudes that are held. So this includes perceptions. Some do not like the word myth, but there are some quote unquote ideas about how things are that came up a lot in the discussion. The SAT analysis also talks quite a lot about and helps us identify transactions within the system. In sort of our findings, the relationships tended to be a better way of thinking about connections that are critical to building momentum and decision making. So for this exercise, we asked the group to walk through their particular enabler or inhibitor and really just list out some of these ideas. The listing was very, I would say, ranges from note-taking to several drawings to some audio that I had to record. And so on the right-hand side is having taken all of that evidence shared during the workshops, trying to illustrate these. So in gray, you have your sort of structures, meaning the institutions and process essential to the theme. In red, you have attitudes, and in blue, you have relationships or descriptions of relationships. So using these as a basis, we went on to map the system building loops, and this very much puts us in the sort of the last phase of the mapping the system and prior to the system dynamics work. So for here, we had a smaller group from the workshops actually do some of the messy work of how do you actually make sense of this complexity and draw some of these enablers, inhibitors that come out. So I'll walk this through briefly. We can come back to this at the end if there's specific questions, but in a sense, we would start with that first theme. So from, for example, coordination and governance was a high-level theme that came out. We'd start with that theme in the center and ask folks to reflect on the causes by drawing up the features raised by participants in the workshop and other input from the group. Now, coordination and governance is obviously a very large general theme. So in this instance, we did ask them to explain a specific part. So one part that came out quite strongly for coordination and governance was around siloed ways of working and the centralization of funding and planning at a national level. So those two, for example, would have been explored fully. So what are some of the drivers behind that? Is there competition for scarce resources? Is there a design question in terms of how our ways of working are designed? And so in going through that, obviously, the stakeholders raised different aspects and really pushed them to ask what is missing in the logic to the story. For example, if there is competition between departments for scarce resources, and that means that we have these silos, there are some intermediary links. And as you're asking them to tell the story, you end up being able to fill in some of them with obviously caveats or questions to explore further, but nonetheless, you help to build a story around what they're saying. And then as you start to have more information about the story, you can actually start to draw some of these loops. Some of them might still need, will always need some iteration and discussion, but some things can be described. For example, some of those relationships or some of those loops, we find that things do get worse. So we would label that a vicious loop. Things are getting better. Virtuous, some are stabilizing, some are stagnating. So again, at the first stage, we asked them to create at least one loop for each of the themes, but knowing that as we get into more detail, we will generate up to 4, if not more. And then with the last bit is the questions around the connections within those loops. So I'll come to that in a bit. As you can see, the image behind shows you a bit more of what that looks like in terms of the navigating the complexity or navigating the chaos, as my colleague said. But again, these are very iterative. So having drawn the first loops, we went back to stakeholders. I can't even count how many times to ask, does this capture? Is there something missing? So this slide makes it look like it's a very guided 6-stage process. It's very much a loop in and of itself. So once you have all of those loops, obviously you saw on the big map I showed you, there is a method to the placing of the loops on the map, and that very much informs the story and the findings at the end. So I'll just speak through that quickly, but just knowing that there was an approach that we took to that. So again, if you can imagine, we have those 4 or 5 loops for a particular topic, and we structured them in a way. So we basically laid them all out on a table and clustered ones that were quite similar to addressing similar issues. So, for example, all of the ones that dealt with silos or ways of working for delivering planning and funding were clustered in the brown area, very much around centralization of coordination and governance. Then we labeled them, describing the dominant theme. Again, those labels went through very iterative discussions about what this actually means. And then we arranged ones that fit logically together. Again, still a very iterative process. We played with them, moved them around, sketched out some of the sort of overarching structure. And what that meant is that, for example, the brown area was very much around governance, bottom left around sustainability, the blue was very much around residents in their role within the system of planning, the developers in red, and then the gray very much being around the sort of wider community things. Now, we wanted folks to individually reflect on it. So in practice, that meant sending out copies of our map, either digitally or visiting people in person with the actual paper one and having them reflect on them and saying, okay, where does this fit, or does this not necessarily capture what story you had shared at the beginning, and then again bringing that group together to have some thinking around where those commonalities were. Even one step further, I would say quite a lot of the granularity and detail around the arrows and the connections between each of the elements was done at a later stage with Dr. Nikki Zimmerman, who helped extraordinarily to help make sure that the flow of the diagram did communicate what we had found in those sessions. And again, this was, I will not underestimate or downplay how much iterative work went into helping to structure the map itself, but then also arranging the loops. So again, just revisiting this picture again, there is an element of still some complex, well, definitely some complexity, but an element of chaos. But I do think there is a way in which we've approached it that allows us to guide each other through the map. So in the final report, we have a section which is literally the guide through the map, and is explaining where to start and how to read and go through it. Now that's great for working with the IPA, particularly as they wanted us to very much test this approach on a question that they were mulling over and confronting in different areas of their work. Now for the so what of what does this mean about, say, housing, or how do we take sustainable living places further and do some more grunt work, I think the guide through the map is one way of exploring this question. But there are also some other visual and narrative tools that we're exploring in our second phase. So I'll say this is very much campaign 1, we've called it, which is very much all of our work linked to the IPA, working closely with their team and really understanding this as an approach of several approaches you could take, and really understanding what that process means. So really helping to enable and support the IPA and other organizations as an intelligent client in thinking about rolling out systems approaches. But in some ways, we found campaigns 2 and 3 going forward would very much think about some of the sort of wider audiences that we've engaged with, particularly as we learned so much from peers within engineering, but definitely many sectors beyond engineering. So I would say for our phases going forward, we're very much in a listening and sharing phase with forums like this. We are working closely with a designer to design up our deliverable for the IPA, but knowing that this is going to inform our subsequent work going forward. We've also worked nicely and closely with an illustrator who's helping us to take this map and helping to translate that into a much more, I wouldn't say digestible, but a much more story-like piece of work. And I will not lie, the illustrator sent me a mock-up of it just before the call. So I'm going to just show you that quickly here. And in the left, again, we have governance in the top left, sustainability, bottom left. She's put master planning here, development and engagement. This is very much a draft and very much trying to capture some of the themes and ideas that were shared in this first map, but in one way that can say, okay, if we're going to be thinking about sustainable living places, what are some of those elements that we should consider going forward? Now, this is draft 1. I know we, much like the map, will have some discussions and conversations about what it's telling us and what it tells folks who've seen it for the first time. One of the challenges with this work is obviously being in the weeds a lot. So getting out and speaking to different people has been absolutely crucial for understanding our message. But again, before I close, I did want to share some of the good practices we've learned from applying this approach, and then some of the lessons learned. I can't iterate enough how many different approaches we we found, and obviously there's some of the reasons why we chose this one are specific to this project, but definitely things to think about in taking these approaches forward. For our team at the Policy Center, we've learned a lot, and I just wanted to share a few of those before we go into questions. But one of the things I guess you've seen, there is a guided process that this approach has allowed us to take for identifying enablers and inhibitors. This is not something specific to the Acumen approach or system dynamics by any means, but I did find for this approach in particular, working across very, very different sectors with different epistemologies and references was a huge challenge at the beginning, and I'm trying to navigate with a language that didn't sort of dilute the detail, but also could bring people along. We found the Acumen approach had a very extensive track record of working in the international development space and trying to marry those two elements in terms of the detail, but also the breadth. We found that this approach also helped us to develop an understanding of the connections within housing and infrastructure. Naturally, I would say in the academy, we were chock full of resources and support on the infrastructure side. We found as we moved into the world of housing, there was lots of engineering expertise and support therein. But also the housing space we found was also so wide. And in a way, we had very much a learning curve. So bringing in different reps from housing associations to developers to folks working in the affordable housing space to folks adapting housing and programs and support for aging populations. It was such a wide range. And of course, the elephant in the room around finance and development being very much a new space for us in the team. And we also found this work did complement sector-specific expertise. We had lots of folks in workshops who really provided a specific lens around transport or environmental sustainability, and this helped sort of bring and capture those, though I'll talk about some of the areas where this approach doesn't necessarily help you look at those subsectors. Again, it helped identify potential leverage points, not necessarily specific to this Acumen approach, but at least guiding us through that process in a way that we could bring different stakeholders along. It illustrated some complex and ingrained behaviors. As from the map, you can very much see there is a almost pre-planning and planning lens in terms of the stage. And what was raised by stakeholders throughout was there's obviously behaviors within the planning system, but also in how programs and projects are funded and supported. But at the same time being, the sort of delivery side and actually developing the stuff is chock full of other behaviors that we wouldn't capture in this map, but nonetheless, this approach helps to tease those out. And it also can inform a discussion about unintended consequences. So this is the area where I would say, as an ongoing piece of work, we're very much thinking about how stakeholder motivations within the map can help, or understanding those stakeholder motivations can help tease out some of the unintended consequences. Some of the lessons learned in terms of things or challenges we confronted in applying the approach, but definitely took forward. This is a participatory process for sure, and it is fairly resource intensive in terms of the iterations. And that this was a very important learning point for us, particularly in looking and exploring new work, making any sort of recommendations for how government might include systems approaches in their work. And we definitely wanted to be very upfront that requires and a sort of understanding and a level of trust in terms of it is a circular process and sometimes doesn't have those specific, this is where you fix the issue. But at the same time, that participatory process means you've developed relationships throughout that can really help when you want to deploy those solutions. We found it's not always a predictive tool in the way that we've applied it here. There are other tools that can help inform scenario planning that perhaps we might want to explore in future, but in this case, that was something we ran into. The scope is definitely limited to the range of stakeholders at a given point in time. No surprises there. I think when we had started, the net zero commitment hadn't been released yet. Now that as we went into our sort of final phase with COVID, there are definitely questions and differences in perception I think stakeholders would share now that we are in different times. But nonetheless, I think that's something to consider for most of this kind of work. We focused a lot on the causal relationships rather than other dynamics of the system. This is something I think for more the stage of the work we've done, but we could go further into other relationships or other dynamics in the system. The process of change required is not always obvious. It probably seems very obvious, but in some ways, going through the process actually helps to show where we might want to start. And again, in creating this big picture view, some of the detailed representations of subsystems and subsectors may not emerge in the wider map, but just to flag that sector expertise was very much important and required all throughout. So on that note, I think I'm going to leave us. I'm going to turn this over for questions and discussion. I have the wide screen, so I'm going to escape the presentation. I can go back to slides at any point, but I also realize I've really overtalked. So I didn't realize it was 10 to. My pardons there, but I guess from the chat, my pardons. I went riffed.
Thank you, Corina.
Sorry about that.
That was great, and a sort of virtual clap because we're excited and interested in the work that you're doing. I wonder if I can bring Anna Miakin to perhaps ask the first question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Amazing piece of work. So I talked to Corina when she was starting the work, and I'm really pleased to see how this all came together. Well done. I guess my question is because coming from a very physical background and the kind of infrastructure planning background, is there? I mean, how do you see the link? Because the map is very much the way how I see it. It's very much a governance kind of map, isn't it? And it talks about the kind of relationships between the decision makers. So how do you see the link between a governance map and then translating that into the way how, for example, infrastructure planning and design, could be affected?
Absolutely. So I would say in what we've presented here was our final sort of high-level map. Along the way, we had drafts which were very, I would say, infrastructure specific, so would map out how the findings we've identified may play out for specific sectors like water, energy, transport. But I guess that was an early stage, and IPA were very much, I guess, interested in what are the questions they might consider for their current infrastructure work if we were to widen the length, the breadth of the implications of infrastructure on these other areas. So what we've found in sort of the end product being very much around governance is now being used at least to inform conversations about some of the wider infrastructure implications. I think I've gone around in a circle, but
will you include these kind of aspects linked to specific infrastructure sectors in the final report, or? Because I think, I mean, depending on how far you got with it, I think that would be really, really helpful, because at least it would give indication for maybe individual infrastructure sectors where to go next, and specifically, if the collaboration in the, these kind of the governance remit actually means that infrastructure design should be integrated as well, what that, how that could be achieved.
Absolutely, and I take that note as something for future work, namely for the first IPA publication or the first product for the IPA was very much on testing the approach and capturing that process with stakeholders. But we've been given license for campaign 2 and 3 to get our hands dirty a bit in terms of what does this mean for our infrastructure partners actually doing the delivery. So you're absolutely right. I think there is. And we've also, I guess, from the housing and planning side, had a request to look more closely at what are the different stakeholder journeys through the map we've developed, but then also for specific sectors.
Yeah.
We've come across that in the workshops, but obviously doesn't feature in the wider map. So this is a level of detail and granularity that I think would help to sort of anchor some of the questions that you've raised in who's responsible and who does that. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Corina, I'd like to ask a question if I
Yeah,
can,
please.
and then I'm going to hand over to James to pick up a couple of questions from
Yeah.
the chat. So I'd really like to ask you about the importance of stakeholder engagement in this work, and I say it partly having done work on multi-criteria mapping myself, and people like Andrew Sterling at SPRU kind of make a claim for the importance of stakeholder buy-in for the rigour of this kind of work. And I wonder, what your experience of that was, and also how that connected with the sort of government and policy angle with the IPA.
Okay, so I would say there's the stakeholder engagement buy-in prior to the project, which I'll summarize, and then just from the project onward. So prior to the project, I would say the National Engineering Policy Center, and I will put our priorities document in the chat, convened our 39 different professional engineering institutions, and mapped out a series of areas that they wanted the new center, the National Engineering Policy Center, to look at. And Sustainable Living Places was one that had emerged from many discussions around infrastructure, but then moving out to housing. So at a level of buy-in from our PEIs and the support from the center, that was something over 18 months that, again, a series of conversations, several different forums for discussion. When we started the project, we found we had quite a lot of systems expertise in-house, but then also realizing there's a lot of different systems expertise externally. So we went through a period of about two to 3 months, I think, as well. So when I had a good conversation with Anna, just trying to understand some of the approaches and finding the one that fit our needs, but then also stakeholders in that housing planning, housing infrastructure and placemaking world. And I think that's where it's a lot more messy, but in a good way. We had, I would say, over 50 conversations with different folks from those sectors. And then at the stage of developing the workshops, we really found we weren't necessarily going to come away with sort of a shared perspective, in the sense, I think the title tells you we have one, but having a shared consensus in the process of how we were defining the system. So I would say that part in engaging different stakeholders throughout the process was really important. And as we did more iterations of the map, became even more important, because the narrative and discussions of what happens on those workshop days and then the map we have at the end, this is still, I would say, ongoing. So if we were to go back now that it's our sort of COVID lens, what are some of the other issues? I think public health would feature much more strongly. I think there's some other issues considering labor and productivity that would be much stronger. So just to echo your point, I think there's a lot of iterative engagement, and then the consensus building part was absolutely crucial. But realizing different systems, different folks have different perspectives.
Corina, I'm keen to get a couple of other questions in if we can, and also to finish as near to the hour as we can. So can I hand over to James to pick up some questions from the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And following on, in fact, from that, one of the questions that we've got here relates to how you dealt with the difference in agendas that may be held by the different stakeholder groups when you're connecting with them initially. That in sort of extending that question a little bit more, when you first approached them, these different stakeholder groups, did you find that you needed to present a slightly different message for the different stakeholders that you want to engage with, and how complicated was that in sort of attempting to bring together the various different varying interests of the people you're looking to engage with?
Absolutely. So I'd say in terms of competing interests and motivations and priorities, I think there was an element of a safe space, in the sense that we were reaching out to folks who either having had previous work or engagement with had already expressed their interest. So there is an element of even some of the more, say, corporate partners who contributed, either developers or landowners. Even that subset, I think we definitely had folks who were open to the message, or at least open to contribute. Now, in terms of how the initial pitch to each of those groups, there was an element of language and really understanding their language. So when you take sustainability, for an example, there is understood in very different ways across the different stakeholders who'd be in that map. So being clear that when we mean sustainability, we really had to derive our definition knowing that it was going to be understood by different folks in different ways. I think for those competing priorities for housing, it was how do you say, it was the obvious Wild West to explore in the UK. So I think a lot of people came to it with either a frustration, but wanting to do something. And I think what we did find was the playing field is so sector siloed in even its own, understanding of what is the system for housing. We found, yeah.
Corina, very quickly,
Of course.
Can we just get in another couple of questions? So
yeah.
One is about how the national gets down to the regional level, and the other is a much more specific question about what the dotted lines and solid lines mean on your map.
Yeah.
And then we'll have to close because we're at the top of the hour.
Yeah, no, of course. Okay, quickly on the map, the dotted lines are the negative connections. So in ones where by doing X, Y decreases. And if we just found it easier than looking for the minus or the plus, the solid lines are the plus. So increasing X increases Y. Just for visual. In terms of the national and the local, this was an obvious issue that came up, particularly, a challenge that we found, particularly understanding the governance. But the governance and planning across the UK is centralized, with the exception of some devolved powers for different nations. Or devolved governments, but the local implementation and the responsibility at a local level to deliver is there. And so while there are very, very strong differences in how some local authorities navigate their capacity, how they're equipped. That being said, I did see there was a note about how, let me just scroll this. Particularly around duplication of efforts at a local level. Now, there is a mechanism called Duty to Cooperate, which was set up to help enable local authorities to work or plan jointly. There are some areas where this could be improved significantly. And our thing that came out was that either things that strengthen that mechanism should be explored. But then there are also some areas where some of this high-level learning could be shared, and this is always going to be a challenge where local is delivering and national is setting the rules. So we have to find ways, either working better horizontally or other bodies that can help. And some of the digital data work was showing that would be welcome. I think, yeah, I saw that I just want to say, in terms of the slides and the report will be out, so I will share the public one. So the IPA one, unfortunately, we do have to keep that for the IPA, but I'm happy to share that. I will have to just take out the illustration because it's not public yet, but I'm happy to share that your way.
Yeah, so Corina, I'm going to bring the webinar to a close, but thank you very much for joining us and for telling us about the extremely interesting work that you're doing at the Royal Academy of Engineering and also with the IPA. And thank you everybody for attending and for putting up with some of the kind of the small issues that we have in this world of engaging digitally. I know that Tim has put details of our next webinar onto the chat, and also of the celebration event that we're going to have for 10 years of the centre. And I really hope that you can join us for that.
Yeah, I'd love to, absolutely. And I think this is also recorded, so
yeah. And we will follow up with slides and so on as we can for participants. So thank you very much, Corina, and thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys. Stay safe. Or I guess I'll